Hi everyone, my name's Jade Sims and I'm the Marketing Specialist at MHS, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Revolutionize the Way You Assess Receptive Vocabulary Acquisition with the Ortiz PVAT. So just a few logistics before we get started. We have a lot of people on the line today, so you're all on mute to minimise background noise, but we do want to hear from you. In the GoToWebinar panel, on the right-hand side, you will see the question pane. Please type in your questions in the question pane, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can towards the end of this webinar. There are also handouts for today's session, and you can download them in the handout section on the GoToWebinar panel. Finally, this webinar will be recorded for any of your colleagues who couldn't make it to the live event today. For those of you who are meeting us for the first time, Multi Health Systems is a global publisher of scientifically validated assessments in the clinical, education, public safety, and talent assessment markets. We are located in Toronto, Canada, and have been in business for over 30 years. We publish assessments in over 50 languages and have a presence in 75 countries around the world. In fact, we're having a truly international conversation today. Although the majority of our registrants are from the US, we also have representation from over 39 countries. We have a mix of school psychologists, speech-language pathologists, and other professionals on the line today. I'd now like to introduce you to our presenter. Sam Ortiz, Ph.D, is a professor of psychology at St. John's University. In addition to his doctorate, he holds a PPS credential in school psychology with postdoctoral training in bilingual school psychology. His research and publications focus on cognitive and linguistic assessment of culturally and linguistically diverse individuals and methods for differentiating cultural linguistic differences from disorders. He is the primary developer of the Cultural Language Interpretive Matrix, co-developer of the CHC Cross-Battery Assessment, and co-author of the book Assessment of Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students, a Practical Guide. I'd also like to introduce you to Dr. Lindsay Ayerst, who will facilitate our Q&A session today. Lindsay is a lead research scientist at MHS for the clinical and education divisions. She's been working at MHS for over 5 years, but has a decade of experience in test development and assessment. I do hope you all enjoy the webinar today, and without further ado, I'll pass you over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Jade. Sorry if there was a brief delay there. I had a little technical difficulty, but I just wanted to welcome you all to the webinar, as Jade announced for you. And I want to thank you for submitting your questions for Dr. Ortiz. I have the great pleasure of being able to ask them on your behalf today. The questions Dr. Ortiz were answered during this webinar were selected because they address the most common themes from all of your submissions. We will try and cover any additional questions that you may come up with, so feel free to use the question pane and enter your questions as we're talking, and we'll answer as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. So Dr. Ortiz, before we do get started, just to get everybody on the same page, I know some people on the line mentioned that they're just joining the webinar because they want to learn a little bit about the Ortiz PVAT. So can you just tell us a little bit about the test before we go into the more specific question and answer period?
Absolutely. The test really is a wide-ranging application. It's something that can be used in a lot of different ways. And some of the more innovative features are things you're going to see popping up on your screen here in terms of the list, in terms of what it does. It really is a test that takes the ideas and the principles regarding evaluation and assessment and extends them not just to using technology, but also to embrace diversity and to ensure from the beginning, from the ground up, evidence of fairness, to be able to be applicable to individuals who are not necessarily native English speakers themselves. And so we're very proud of the accomplishments and the things that are built into it. And it is a very simple test that uses a good deal of technology to be able to facilitate the administration, makes it quick and efficient. There are things like built-in screeners that determine the starting points without you having to worry about what the basal is or how many correct. The ceiling is determined automatically. The norm sample spans the age range that is most appropriate for children in school, preschool, 2.5 actually to 2211. And it provides dual norms, which we'll probably talk about later, and I know has come up in some of the questions regarding what that means and how that makes it more applicable and more fair as a test of vocabulary, receptive vocabulary in general. So it's a very interactive test, and it's very engaging by presenting pictures. It measures receptive vocabulary, and because of that, it really has applications in at least 5 different areas. We designed it intentionally to be able to range from the beginning, where most people think of a test as a diagnostic indicator of some kind. The test does do that. It does provide that type of information, which is relevant to people like school psychologists, speech language paths, neuropsychologists, clinical psychologists, but it goes beyond that. For example, speech language pathologists often have to do treatment as well as an evaluation. So the test provides links to what would be done next, how you could improve, how you could provide linguistically appropriate intervention for a child who is evaluated by the test. And then beyond that, it begins to extend into other areas as well, including instruction. One of the most difficult things is when you've evaluated a child who has either a language problem or is an ELL with a language disability is how do you reach that child in terms of the instruction? What do you have to do to modify it? And beyond that, you have issues when you're working with children who may not have even yet been identified as having a disability. How do you know that their progression through the academic system isn't really due to this cultural linguistic difference, or it's truly attributable perhaps to a disability? And the progress monitoring capabilities built into the test, along with the growth index, which is a customized score that provides an indication of change and actual growth, give pre-referral kinds of teams or activities the ability to detect and monitor and actually measure in a very valid way the language acquisition of individuals who are not only monolingual native English speakers, but also who may be bilingual English language learners.
Well, thank you so much. So that just gives us sort of the foundation. And now I will start asking the questions that were submitted to us by our registrants.
Sure.
If you don't hear your exact question, it's probably because we may have modified it ever so slightly to ensure that it was comprehensive with respect to the themes of the questions that were coming in. So James from Arizona asked, Dr. Ortiz, you've been working in this area for a long time. What drives your interest in the assessment of culturally and linguistically diverse individuals?
Well, I think probably one of the things that drives my interest is the fact that I am culturally and linguistically diverse myself. I am bilingual and bicultural. And although that seems like a given, especially given my name and my appearance perhaps, the reality is I was 35 years old before I even knew that I was bilingual and bicultural. That was something that didn't even occur to me because it had never been a part of my own education, part of anything that was done for me, not a part of the testing that I underwent as a child. Nobody ever cared about it. It was an irrelevant variable that I had long distanced myself from. And it wasn't until I was respecializing in school psychology from clinical that I attended a program at San Diego State University, a multicultural program for the first time in my life, where it was, brought to my attention, you are bilingual and you are bicultural. And I began learning about these issues, and it just resonated with me so much because now the first, 3.5 decades of my life were there in print in front of me and all of the things that I was reading about. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is my life story. And so I have brought that kind of personal experience into my professional education and training and my research in a way that is just very fulfilling because it encompasses everything that I'm all about. So in many ways, this test represents not just the culmination of my work as an academician or a researcher over the past 25 years, but also probably a reflection of my own experiences as an English learner from birth over the past almost 6 decades.
Fabulous. So the next question comes to us from Anna from New Mexico, and she asks, can you tell me about the use of 2 sets of norms in the Ortiz PVAT?
Yes. When you start creating a test and you're trying to build it from the ground up with respect to diversity, a lot of people have thought, well, the answer to that is you then take the test and you translate it or you adapt it in some way into another language for people that speak another language. So in essence, you're taking the same test and you're creating 2 different versions of it. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not very practical. I mean, if you're talking about Spanish, yes, because there's a large population of Spanish speakers. But you get beyond Spanish, now you have a third test you'd have to develop, and then a fourth one. There are over 350 different languages spoken in the United States alone. It's just not practical to keep developing a new test for each one of them. So we thought, in order to address the issue of fairness, we have to use a more common metric, and we thought English is that common metric. Even an English learner is learning English. Native English speakers are only learning English. So by using that, we were able to say, why don't we create, instead of two different tests, one test that has two different norms, so that we're only going to compare native English speakers to other native English speakers. And then we compare English learners only to other English learners who have had the same level of exposure to English, the same opportunity for learning English as other English learners, rather than as English learners in general. And so that was the foundation for creating essentially a single test, but that has applicability to a person or an individual who's learning English, regardless of their native language, whether it's English or whether it's another one. And that really is the foundation of why those are necessary. Plus, and I'm sure some of the other questions we'll ask about this and we'll discuss it more, why a separate set of norms is actually even necessary. But that's the fundamental basis, is that you cannot compare individuals who've learned only one language to other individuals who've learned two languages or more. And because of that, separate norms are necessary. And that's what we did.
Right. So I know there were a number of questions about the norms in general, so we tried to theme them for you. But in relation to the norms, Rita from Ontario asked, I'm interested in learning more about the norming groups used for the English language learner norm. So I guess she's specifically interested in who's included in the English language learner norm sample.
Right. And that's a great question, because it is a complicated process. In fact, that was something that we understood immediately was going to make this whole thing very, very difficult. And the fact that we've had over 7 years of time in development really is a testament to how long it took to be able to master the notion of extending norms from the typical two-dimensional kind of framework into 3 dimensions, where you add language exposure as an additional variable. And I think the next slide really kind of highlights this, because on the left you see the variables that are typically used when tests are standardized. And you have age, you have gender, you have geographic location, you have SES, in our case we use parental educational level, and then you have race and ethnicity. Now, that's very standard, and most tests that are developed for native English speakers use precisely this, and most tests that are developed even in other languages continue to use this framework. But it's not enough when it comes to an English learner. A person comes to the United States, enters school, or is living here, by definition, if they're in school, has to learn English. And so that means they become an English learner the moment they're here, and then become a de facto bilingual. And that can happen in different ways. There are sequential bilinguals, there are simultaneous bilinguals, but the fact of the matter is they're no longer monolingual speakers. And so they need to be evaluated against people that are like them. There has to be an assumption of comparability for the norms to be valid. And so we've added and extended, as you can see on the right-hand side here of the column, additional variables to make that happen. And so when you go down the list, well, typically we do still have age, gender, we still have geographic location, parental education level. Interestingly, race and ethnicity is not controlled specifically because 2 reasons. Number one, it isn't race or ethnicity that actually makes a difference in performance. One of our analyses really shows this to be very, very clear, and we're very proud of this because it's tremendous evidence of fairness, that a language-oriented test does not actually show any difference between the performance of individuals from different racial groups. Yeah. But the real reason that it's not in there, even though we did look at them, is that it isn't a person's skin color. It's the amount of exposure they've had to English that dictates their performance on a test that is actually measuring language. And so, as you can see, we took that into account, and we controlled for it in 2 different ways. We actually sampled 53 different languages for the ELL sample. Okay. 53 different languages, not just one other language or 2 or 5 or 10, 53 of them. And then, on top of that, we also sought to ensure representation according to the amount of English a child has heard and has been learning. That is, how much exposure have they had in their current lifetime, based on how old they are at the moment, how much English exposure has there been? And by varying that, then we're allowing that to become the aspect of measurement that creates the difference in how children perform, which again, the statistics bear this out, that it is the amount of exposure that a person has that can be quite different. A real good example, in case somebody wants something a little more detailed, but when I was 10 years old, I was already in school for 5 years, starting in kindergarten. So I had been learning English for 5 years.
Right.
Okay, but there was another kid in my class in 5th grade, 10 years old, Hispanic like me, okay, but he'd only been in the U.S. 1 year. He had been educated primarily in Spanish in Puerto Rico, then came here last year, so he's been learning English for 1 year.
Right.
We're both ELLs. We're both Hispanic. We're both male. We're both from the same SES, both in the same race. We're completely matched as much as you could be.
Sure.
But if you test us in English, I'm going to kick his butt because I know more English. I've been learning it 5 times as long as he's been learning it.
Yeah, that's not a fair comparison.
Not a fair comparison. So the need was to make sure that you're only evaluating the performance of ELLs as compared to other like ELLs, not just ELLs as a general group. And
Right.
so the characteristics are all built in there. We had 11 different categories for being able to do that. We cut some of those categories into smaller chunks to make sure we had full representation across the spectrum of exposure for each of the age ranges as well. And that's how we were able to do it, but that explains why it's kind of complicated and difficult to do.
Absolutely. I think we have a few slides. I'm not sure if we still have them, kind of walking them through some of the makeup of the sample, even though this is a really nice summary slide.
Right. And so down at the bottom here, they can see already, what the 2 unique features are in terms of why that norm sample is necessary and what it all means. We also have additional slides here that are contained in the technical manual that anyone can access if they want online as well once they purchase the test. And they're able to see here what those specific ratios are. And a lot of this is very typical because it matches U.S. Census population demographics and statistics. And that's typically how things are done there. So none of this is terribly, terribly surprising until really you get to the other factors that we were talking about. This is something that people who are familiar with testing would probably say, oh yeah, here's what the population statistics are, here's what our sample contains. And as you can see, they're all quite representative of the U.S. population in almost every way, matching it very, very nicely and creating a norm sample representation that is very good. And here's the one that is specific to the length of language exposure and the percentage of life exposed in terms of what those numbers are and how it generates the final sample, and then what the percentages are for each one of those, which were used then later on to be able to create the algorithm that provides the predicted raw score for people that might have a little bit more or a little bit less than what the actual percentages are in terms of the categories here. Because the test is continuously normed, and this is also another important feature. It is not normed based on just these 11 blocks. So you don't get compared to children if you, let's say, only have 1 month of English. You're not compared to children who are from 0 to 6. You're only compared to children who have 1 month of English.
Right.
It'll go down to that level of specificity by using the continuous norming process to be able to predict what that should be. And as you increase in age, as your percentage of lifetime exposure changes, the continuous norms continue to account for that, so you have an accurate prediction of actual expected level of performance at every age level throughout the test.
Gotcha. Okay, so Sarah from Alberta asked, so this is related to the norms then, how do you determine a child's exposure to English? How do you calculate that?
Yeah, this is a very tough question because it's not necessarily easy to do, and it's not something that can be easily quantified. And so we didn't attempt to do that within the test to say, well, if you answer these questions, then here's the amount. That would be inappropriate. There's just too much information that can be brought to bear to make that determination. And it is something that's going to require some degree of clinical judgment in being able to make that determination. Now, the way that it actually happens, to give you an idea, is that when you're setting the test up and you're preparing to launch it, the user is asked about the child's language background. So here you see the first 2 questions, you see the first screen that provides the question regarding, is the examinee a native English speaker or an English learner, or perhaps you don't know. Now, if you know that they're an English speaker, you just click English speaker, the criteria are listed for you there. And essentially that's for monolingual native English speakers. That's all that button should be used for.
Okay.
Anyone else who has exposure to really any extent, probably in another language, should be clicking on the English learner button. And if you're not sure, you can click Don't Know, and it'll run you through the same questions as it would for the English learner to help you determine what that level of difference might be. So if you're not sure, just go ahead and click Don't Know, but it'll give you the same kind of prompts. So in this case, since English speaker is easy to determine, it's the English learner, which relates to the amount of lifetime exposure. So by doing that, if you click that button or the Don't Know, you come to this screen, and this screen then shows a couple of questions that you begin to answer. The first question obviously is, what's their primary language of instruction at this time? So if they are not a native English speaker, but have been instructed in English, this starts to give you an idea of how much English exposure might have been there and when that might have started. So it's information you probably already have, but it just reminds you of where that is and what the importance is as well. But if a child's getting a bilingual program, for example, or getting native language instruction in the U.S., then again, that clues you into, okay, so even though they might have started school at kindergarten or first grade, the fact is they were getting native language instruction. That means only half of their day was in English. So it lessens what your estimate might be about when they actually have begun to learn English. The second question relates to the language used primarily in the home. So this gives you another idea of how much and to what extent English is or is not being used. And you want to evaluate not just how much, but the quality of it as well. How educated, how literate are the parents in English if the child is actually hearing that level of English? I recall when my parents would speak English to me, it was really pretty fraught with a lot of grammatical errors because it wasn't their native language. By the time I was in second or third grade, my English was already better than theirs. But I heard them speaking that way. So the English that I was actually learning from my parents wasn't really as good as English I was learning elsewhere, which was actually more correct. But something to consider. It's the third question that's listed here that is really the most important one. And this is the one that you have to look at and understand clearly in terms of what it's asking, because we need an age at which the child first began to learn English. But it isn't meant to be strictly like, okay, they heard their first word of English at this point and that's the beginning of it. No, it really represents the degree of consistency in learning English. When were they formally exposed to it in a consistent way so that you can say the opportunity for learning English began at that point? That's really what you want to look at. And that's where, we give you some examples of things like, what kind of language are they hearing in the home, school, the community, or exposure to other things. But it also includes the education that I was talking about, what kind of native language program and the parental education. So all of these are factors that probably can be addressed through the pre-referral process even, where when you get the referral and you're looking back on the history of the child, you can answer and you can address that. That's what you really want to do there. But it is the most significant thing because all of those factors provide the context for saying, I would say that given the child's age, here's the point at which I can document that formal English language exposure has begun. Right. Whether it might have begun a little bit earlier, but not very consistently, or a little bit later, but you want to make that determination. And if you're uncomfortable with what you initially determined, it is a variable that can be altered and a test can be rescored without any difficulty in being able to do that. Yes. There's a limitation to the age, which if we get a question about it, I'll talk about it because it has to do with the screener. But if you think you over or underestimated, it can be adjusted. But you really want to make an effort to be as accurate as possible about how much time you believe the individual has been given to learn English. And once you do that, then that's what sets the amount of lifetime exposure. The program calculates it automatically, and then uses that to establish what the expected level of performance should be.
Gotcha. Thank you. So the next question takes us in a bit of a different direction. Maricela from Texas asked, what makes the test unique in terms of its administration?
There are a couple of things I think that make it very, very unique. Number one, it's an all-digital test. So there's no longer any need to have to worry about materials like an easel where you have to flip over and go from one to the other. You actually have stimuli that look more like this. The other thing is, by making it digital, we're able to incorporate real photos, objects that are actual objects that children see and look like what they are, rather than, let's say, illustrations or cartoon type drawings that are more, representations, more symbolic than actual real representations. The format, in terms of the way that it's given, is very simple because it allows the user to be able to either use a touchscreen to touch the answer, with iPads or with touchscreen tablets today, or even touchscreen laptops. Touching is very common, and it's becoming more common. So it's easier sometimes, or just more natural, for a child to reach up and to want to touch something. But if they need to, they can use a mouse. And if it needs to be assisted, it could be done that way as well. If you have motor difficulties, but you can indicate to me what your response is by 1, 2, 3, or 4, I can then click or touch for you and move you through the test as well. You have standardized prompts. The items are presented in a standardized way so that, again, the user doesn't have to learn how to pronounce the particular words. When the selections are made, you see that the square is highlighted, but the administration doesn't move to the next item until the next button is clicked. And the reason for that is then it confirms that you're ready to move on. So the examinee knows as soon as I click next, now I'm going to hear the next one. So it's not when I click and select that I automatically hear it, because if you're contemplating whether that was your final answer or not, you might then change your mind and you might not be ready for what you hear next. So once you do that, it moves forward to the next one, and then you get the next item and it's provided to you there. So you can see that from the illustrations, we have, again, real objects with a nice kind of balance between them so that there's no one picture that stands out. It allows the user to either know what it is, or if they have to guess or decide to guess, then they're not like drawn to any particular kind of picture. So the administration is really very good, I think, in terms of the built-in screener, which gives you the starting point. So again, you don't have to worry about that. The built-in ceiling rule, so that once the test is complete, the child doesn't see anything more. They don't know that there are actually other items. They might think that's the end of the test and that the only way that it looks, and it's not any different. So these are things that are really kind of new and embracing technology in a way to facilitate the process of administration so that clinicians can spend more time observing the child's interaction with the task rather than spending time trying to learn how to manipulate materials.
Understood. And actually, I think the point that you said that it's engaging, somebody had mentioned, we also asked registrants to indicate the challenges that they're having with the test that they're using now. And a few people mentioned having challenges, particularly with people with ADHD and autism, and having them sustain attention to the entire battery. So the fact that this is engaging and helps them, they actually find it fun, sort of like a game-like design.
Absolutely. And there's evidence of that in some of the studies that are included in the technical manual as well that show that children with ADHD perform nearly equally as well as children without ADHD. They really do enjoy the task. And young children as well really pay attention and stick with it because it's very game-like for them.
Right. Okay, so Francisco from California asked, why can't I just use a nonverbal test for English language learners?
Well, to use a nonverbal test is to run away from the very thing that is causing the problem in evaluation in the first place. If language is not an issue, then a nonverbal test can work almost as well as anything else. There still may be some slight differences because even some nonverbal tests have some cultural content or may use some type of communication that isn't necessarily verbal but represents some type of learning. So something might get in the way. But it's also then focusing on abilities like visual processing or maybe some nonverbal reasoning skills, maybe some visual memory, but they don't focus on language. In other words, a nonverbal test actually avoids the whole issue of dealing with language. And when you're working with an English learner, it's in the name, right? It's an English learner. It is the language that is the problem that gives us all the problems. So the reality is that, you can't really say, I can effectively evaluate an English learner simply by avoiding language and just doing everything nonverbally. Right. Language is just too important. It's too correlated with overall ability. It's too correlated with academic outcomes, particularly in reading and writing. It's just too much in terms of its contribution to overall success to say, well, I'll know how the person is doing if I just avoid it. And because it is the variable that we're tracking, we're monitoring, we're trying to figure out, are they advancing in language? Because that's what we're interested in. Then you can't do that with a nonverbal test. You need a verbal test to be able to say, this is what I want to measure, and here is a fair way of measuring that. And there are no ways to be able to do that with a nonverbal test.
All right. So our next one is from Jennifer in Nevada, and she said, I'm an SLP, so she's a speech-language pathologist in a school district, and I mainly work with children who are English speakers, not English learners. So does this test have any value for me?
Absolutely, and I mentioned it at the very beginning. This is a single test with two sets of norms, rather than a test that is a native language that is meant only for speakers of another language. So everything that we've talked about, all of the benefits, the administration, the engagement, the ease, the embracing of the technology, the facilitation of starting points, basals and ceilings, all of that still applies to the testing of a child in English. The other thing is it has a wide range of application all the way down to 2.5. So even people working with very young children or older children in high school or even post-high school still have a single test that they can use. But beyond that, and this question is from a speech language pathologist, the speech language paths often do treatment and intervention. So frequently their job is not just to evaluate and then walk away. You've got to do something. So you've identified the child as having a problem. Now what are you going to do to help remediate that problem? Well, our test provides an assessment report that gives specific recommendations regarding what the instructional level is for that child. And this is regardless of whether they're an English learner. Not only instructional level, but then what would be appropriate interventions to help advance that child's language, and what would be appropriate kinds of instructional strategies to be able to give the teachers in the classroom to help assist that child as well. So all of that applies whether or not the child's an English learner or an English speaker. And they're the kind of links that I don't think you typically get from tests, because diagnostic tests, by and large, give you diagnostic information, don't often have links to intervention or to instruction. And yet I know that, particularly in speech language pathology, you want all of that, as would I would imagine anybody else working with children in the schools. So it's of greater value than the kinds of things that you can probably get from other tests today.
Right. No, I think that's important. It's not just you get the results, it's what you can do with those results now, and there's guidance on that.
Exactly.
So that's great. Okay, so our next question is from Deborah from Alaska, and she said, how can the results from the Ortiz PVAT inform diagnostic decision-making for ELL students, distinguishing ELL from LDO? So this is our typical sort of difference versus disorder that we talk about a lot.
Correct. And, you know, when it comes to diagnostic evaluations, that sort of refrain, the difference versus disorder. Is it a cultural linguistic difference, or is it a true disorder in terms of the individual's performance or their lack of academic performance that's been observed? That's the hurdle that is most difficult to get over. This is an issue of validity, because when you give a test to an English learner, how do you know that your results are actually valid, especially if you're not comparing that English learner to other English learners with the same level of English exposure, as I gave in my example earlier about being in 5th grade and 10 years old. So diagnostically, that's probably one of the more fundamental applications of the test. Not the only one, but it is one of the more fundamental ones. And this question is concerned about how does the test actually provide that? And I think the next couple of slides actually kind of begin to show how this question is really addressed. And here, you know, you see on this particular slide the normal curve. You would see the child's performance. In this case, it was a 94. You get the confidence interval. That's a 95% confidence interval. The standard measure of the test is only 2 points, so a 95% confidence interval is only 4 points. So it's very precise. It's not a subtest, because people are thinking sometimes, well, it's only measuring one ability. Does that make it a subtest? The answer is no. There are 167 items on both Form A and another 167 on Form B. So it's a very diagnostic test and very, very reliable based on the statistics that I'm showing you here. And what it gives you is, you know, besides the raw score, the standard score, the percentile rank, staying 9 age equivalent, you know, the classification. And this allows you then to know whether or not this child's acquisition of English vocabulary is consistent with other children who have had the same amount of exposure and opportunity for learning English. So by comparing like to like, if this score is in the average range, then you know that their language acquisition process is just normal. It is attributable to the process of second language acquisition. It's only when this score would be lower than average, lower than that ELL average with the same level, that you begin to say, maybe there's something more going on. And that would be perhaps an indication that maybe there is a disability of some kind. Right. And maybe it's language related, because if it was a disability not related to language, obviously this isn't going to show it. But this could still help establish that whatever results you might be looking at otherwise are not due to language either, because the language appears to be developing normally, so we can't attribute problems to being language. So apart from that, you know, the assessment report provides the intervention recommendations that we were just talking about, the instructional guidance that we were talking about. And if you're working with an English learner, whether or not you identify them as having a disability, you have to do something about it. You don't just say, well, I evaluated, they have a disability, now I'm done, and we don't have to worry about the kid because the labeling solves the problem. It doesn't solve the problem. And likewise, if you determine the child is average in terms of their development and it isn't a disability, you don't just say, well, go back to general ed and we don't have to hear from you again. No. You have to do something. And these are strategies here that can be used. And you can see they're very, very specific. They're not generic. And they're keyed to several factors. They're keyed to how old the child is, their performance on the test, whether they're an English learner or not, and whether they're in school or not, and what level they happen to be in. So it's appropriate for all of those levels, and this can be fed back to the teachers or to pre-referral teams to run different interventions that might be more successful because they would be more linguistically appropriate for the child's actual level. So there's tremendous information. Here you see the interpretation of the instructional level that is given, and this gives you an idea regarding the intensity of the needs that the child might have. And that intensity can change from year to year, from child to child, from ELL to non-ELL. It's all built in. We also provide a method for vocabulary type of analysis where the words here, the nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and prepositions are in the developmental sequence of English. So you get more nouns and more verbs than you do like prepositions and so on, because those are acquired much later. But it gives you an idea then of what type of words the child should be acquiring and whether they're having any difficulty. By knowing the number % correct, you get an idea. You can then even write goals or objectives if you wanted to be able to say, okay, we're going to focus on this type of word because it's something that this child seems to be having difficulty with. We also provide that in terms of the concepts of BICS and CALP, which people working with ELLs are very familiar with. They're Jim Cummins' work in terms of basic interpersonal communication skills versus the cognitive academic language proficiency. And because we have the words arranged in a particular order, they also fall out by BICS versus CALP, and then early or emergent BICS versus intermediate versus advanced, then to earlier emergent CALP to intermediate to advanced CALP. You know whether or not a child is picking up on social language or having more trouble with content-based language, and whether or not they're at the level that would be expected in terms of those types of words and where they are. So there's tremendous diagnostic relevance obviously built into the test, and all of this information can be used not only to determine whether there's a difference versus disorder, but also what to do about it after you've made that decision.
Right. Thank you. So Nicole from Florida is asking if you're able to talk about the use of the test in a school setting.
Yeah. It was important to us to recognize that a diagnostic test would be very limiting because then it would only be used in terms of comprehensive evaluations. So kind of like what we were answering in the question before. That would be a comprehensive evaluation. Is this a disability or not a disability? But that's only one area in which, let's say, ELLs encounter the school system or have difficulties or create problems for the school system. There are several other areas that really needed to be attended to, and we took those into account to create a test that can range from applicability in general education all the way through special education. And so beyond diagnostic, we also provide information regarding the interventions and treatments or the intervention kinds of things that can be done. And in that capacity, that's something that pre-referral teams could use to observe and see if the implementation of these interventions actually improves the child's function. Now, to be able to do that properly, obviously, you'd need additional information, and we give that in terms of things like progress monitoring capability. The test has a Form A and a Form B, which are parallel, and I mentioned that, highly, highly correlated between the two. And you can repeat the measurement really very, very frequently. I wouldn't even hesitate to do it weekly if you wanted to. There may be too much testing, but you can do it because the test is sensitive to that kind of change. And vocabulary is a natural ability because there's so many words and kids are acquiring them all the time. It is very amenable to short period kind of reevaluation. But the scores can then be plotted and you can examine them to determine, is there any progress being made? Is the percentage of words correctly going up or down? Right. There's tremendous progress monitoring information for, again, pre-referral. Likewise, there's a growth index built in. And the growth index is, I think, just phenomenal because it gives you the capacity to measure actual change or growth, both positive and negative, okay, in a child from administration to administration to administration. And this is truly unique. It's a customized statistic that we had to develop for the test to be able to provide that kind of information because there are very few tests that actually look at measurable growth. If you look at the standard score or the percentile ranks, a child making 1 year's worth of growth stays at the same percentile rank and the same standard score. That's not going to help you determine what kind of growth is actually taking place. Right. So you have that plus the instructional strategies that I mentioned. You know, you're talking to teachers, you're talking to pre-referral teams, you're talking to any kind of monitoring or progress monitoring or evaluation regarding language acquisition, such as for Title III compliance in the school system. And then you have the diagnostic and interventions on top of that as well. So it really is designed to assist in all of the areas in which ELLs will encounter the school system and for which there may be a need to have information that you can't get otherwise.
Right, sounds like it. Well, this one leads nicely into what you were just talking about. Lori from Nevada is asking about progress monitoring. So I know that our progress monitoring report isn't out yet, but it will be released shortly. But if you want, is there anything else you want to add to your discussion of monitoring progress in a child?
Yeah, I think it's something that does merit further explanation. So I'm glad this is the follow-up question here. And it almost seems like we planned it that way, almost, right? But it is important because it is something that is commonly undertaken, particularly in school settings, but even in general. You want to know whether or not the child is making growth. Language is one of those areas in which language growth and proficiency is assessed all the time. Now, the test itself is not a, quote, language proficiency measure because it's not a comprehensive measure of language. But vocabulary, particularly receptive vocabulary, is an ideal general indicator of language growth because it's the first thing that happens. When children are learning a second language, they follow the same sequence as learning the first language. And that first phase is pre-production phase. And pre-production is called the silent period because children don't have the capacity for speech yet. So speech hasn't even emerged. They are listening and they're comprehending. They're taking in into their mind words and they're forming knowledge. So it is vocabulary. And receptive vocabulary is ideal because the child doesn't have to say anything. And that's why we can measure their actual language acquisition down to 1 month of having learned English, or even actually less than that. You could probably evaluate a kid the day they got here. And of course, the test will tell you, well, they don't know any English, but that's true. But that's normal for somebody who has no exposure to English. But all the way up, you can follow them. And so the next slide really shows the significance of what you get from that because it indicates, in this particular scenario, a child who has a standard score, it's 196, 90, and then 89. And so you see, okay, there seems to be a drop going on, but you might interpret that as being, well, the 89's confidence interval, 85 to 93, is within normal limits to the average range. So maybe you're thinking, all right, they're not as high as they were when they were younger, so they're kind of leveling off maybe, and so you have this sense that, they're still kind of average overall. But if you look at the growth index, which is the graph to the right of it, that's where you see how much growth has actually been taking place from one administration to the next, and from the next administration to the next. And you can compare up to 5 different administrations on the assessment report, the progress report once it becomes available, and you get this kind of comparison. And the number that is right above the bar there, or right below the bar in this case, is the growth index. Mm-hmm. And we've provided a scale for you so you can easily see whether that growth has been as expected, or more than expected, or less than expected, or much less than expected. Right. And in this case, obviously, it shows an overall from 1 to 4 growth rate of much less expected, which suggests this child's learning, especially with respect to vocabulary acquisition, is going down. And this would be something that would be of great concern. This might then indicate, all right, do we need to do a follow-up evaluation? Do we need to do a comprehensive evaluation? It suggests there's more going on here than just the normal process of second language acquisition. And that's information that you wouldn't get otherwise. If a test that is being used for, let's say, Title III compliance, like most states use something like the WIDA, the SALT, or the LPAC, there's a whole bunch of those kinds of tests. But they give you a category, and the child might be category 3, 3, 3, or it might be 4, 4, 4, and you're wondering, well, they're just staying the same. Are they making progress? Well, that isn't going to tell you. The growth index will actually tell you whether there is progress being made or whether there isn't progress being made. Right. And you can see the instructional recommendations that follow along with it are going to be very helpful because they provide the changes in terms of what needs to be done as the child progresses across those administrations. And then likewise, you still have the parts of speech which continue to be analyzed from one to the other, which can be charted to determine what kind of progress is going on. And you have the word types as well that I mentioned before with respect to BICS and CALP to being able to chart what's happening. And in this case, you can see that by the time the child, I believe they were 6 years old, by the time they got to about 3rd grade, there was a steep drop in their performance. And why that was occurring, not really sure because the test isn't going to tell you that, but we know that it's unusual. Right. And that means something is happening. Whether that's because of the instruction or some other factor needs to be determined. But here you know that there's been a precipitous drop in this child's actual performance.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're getting short on time, and you've been submitting some great questions, so we'll see what we can do. We do have one more question here. So Edward from New York was asking, how do you see this test fitting into a neuropsychological assessment, if you want to briefly speak about that?
You know, neuropsychologists typically look at language as a cross-domain kind of ability. And so you want to evaluate how language functions and may affect their performance on various types of activities and tasks or abilities. And if you don't know where that child's language is, then you might be more likely to say that poor performance on a task that required language might be indicative of a problem because language was low, so therefore it's getting in the way. If you use the test at the very beginning of the evaluation, then you have a complete idea as to whether or not that child's language acquisition is normal or not. That immediately helps you rule out the fact that if I see issues in verbally related tasks later on, it's not likely that it's due to a language-based problem. It's got to be due to the fact that it's a language difference issue. And that would preclude you then from making kinds of attributions or interpretations that would be incorrect or discriminatory because the low score of language would seem to bring it down, and then you would think it was a real problem when it's not. And that probably applies to not just neuropsych evaluations, but really any type of evaluation where language is fundamental to what is being evaluated.
Thank you. And we do one from Bruce from Georgia. He says, does this test help gain insight in deciding between testing in English versus testing in the native language?
No, not really. You know, whether you test in English or you test in the native language is something that clinicians often decide on their own, and usually as a function of like language dominance. But just because a child is dominant in one language doesn't mean the testing in that language is going to be valid. You know, I was dominant when I, was dominant in Spanish when I started kindergarten. By the time I'm in second grade, I'm dominant in English. But testing me in English at that point doesn't mean that you're going to get valid results because I'm still a bilingual kid. So the real issue is not what language are you supposed to evaluate in. The real issue is, can you make a comparison in a way that is fair and non-discriminatory? And the only way to do that is to have English learner norms so that you compare English learners to those norms. And only our test actually provides that at this time.
Right. Okay, so we do have Christina from Texas, and she says, I work with children in early childhood programs, so is there any benefit of assessing children at a young age?
Tremendous benefit. In fact, one of the things that's almost required in preschool programs is evaluating children to see if they're developing okay as part of like child find and responsibilities for school districts in particular to ensure that young children are getting whatever they need should they happen to have a disability. And the problem is when ELLs especially enter the preschool kind of system, a lot of the instruction and a lot of the expectations for development are based on English speakers. So therefore, they look really far behind. And the question becomes, are they really developing normally, or, how far behind are they? And I think people at that point really are at a loss to know whether or not this is a potential disability. So our test actually gets to that question directly because it's diagnostic in nature and goes down to 2.5. So even before a child enters at the age of 3, you can still evaluate whether or not their language acquisition in English is appropriate or not. So I think it has tremendous kinds of applications for preschool, but all the way up through the entire age range as well.
All right, so I know the next question coming up was actually a very popular question from many of our registrants. Don't know if we have time to discuss it in great depth, but I know they're wondering what's the difference, if they haven't heard it from you already, between this test and other tests of receptive vocabulary.
Yeah. The greatest difference is the structure of the test and what it brings to the table in terms of efficiency, fairness, and I would say validity of the obtained results. We give all kinds of tests. We get all kinds of scores. People think they know what those scores mean. You can't really interpret a score for an individual without understanding their context. And the most important context or contextual variable for an English learner is going to be how long have they been learning English, particularly when they're tested in English. It's the same question when you go into their native language. But the problem is we can't create language-specific versions of the test for all 350 different languages. So English, for better or for worse, is what we have. And that's what you need to do. Other tests are English only and then a translated version of it. And while that has some applicability to that language, as I mentioned, if the norms of that test aren't stratified by English learners and stratified by amount of exposure, you're not getting valid results that are going to provide you with the information that you're trying to seek. So these are some of the greatest differences. This is a new direction in testing. This is something that sets the bar higher than has ever been set before when it comes to ensuring fairness in a test, and in a way, with a norm reference test in particular, that has never been accomplished before. This is totally brand new, and I think that means that our test stands head and shoulders above anything else that you could actually look at today.
Thank you. So we have had amazing questions coming in. I'm not sure we have enough time to get through a lot of them, but your answers are so complete that I think a lot of them have been answered in the course of our discussion, which has been great. If I can pull some, so I'm looking away from the cameras because I've got the computer over here with your incoming questions. Who's allowed to administer the test?
It's a level B test, so that means that a person with training can administer the test. Now, most psychological tests are level C, which restricts their use to people who have gone through graduate training programs in testing and understand psychometrics. And that's because the diagnostic part of it requires that level of training for high-stakes decision-making. At a level B, a teacher, for example, could be taught to administer it. However, they should not be permitted to interpret the diagnostic component of the test. For them, the instructional recommendations, even intervention would be okay. The progress monitoring and the growth index would all be perfectly reasonable for them to use, understand, and deal with. But even so, doing that would require some degree of training. So it's not something they should look at the diagnostic portion. That's something that trained professionals like school psychs, speech language paths, neuropsychologists have access to, but the teachers can do the other part, and they can certainly be trained to administer.
Right, and I hope we have time to grab one more here. So somebody's saying that they actually see people who are multilingual, not bilingual.
Oh, yeah.
So is this test equally applicable in that
Yes,
scenario?
Absolutely. Again, it's regardless of whether you're learning English as your first, second, third, or 10th language, doesn't make any difference in the sequence of learning. All it means is that if you've learned 1, 2, or 3 languages before you get to English, you don't have much English going on for you. But that's fine. That's what you use to determine, well, how much exposure to English has there been? Once you've determined that, then you're okay, because the child is still only evaluated against other individuals with that same level of exposure to English, regardless of whatever languages might have preceded it. The acquisition of English is invariant in that way. It doesn't really change at what age you're learning it or whether it's your first or your 10th language. Although some people who are very well educated in the language can learn the language faster, and so they'll get higher standard scores on the test, but the sequence does not get altered.
Understood. Well, thank you so much. I wish we could keep going. I feel like we could easily spend another hour talking about this.
Happy to do
and
so.
the questions just keep coming in, but we do have to wrap up the hour. If you just want to advance the slide for us. I did have a question of my own that I hope to save a smidge of time, but I think you've addressed it. But what impact do you hope the Ortiz PVAT will have? You know,
I'll be very brief here. I hope that it is a tremendous impact because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is all about fairness. This is all about what I remember and have experienced and learned about, my entire life, both through my education as well as just being alive as an English learner. And the hope is that we change the way that evaluations are conducted and that we improve the decisions that we make for English learners or even for general English speakers so that they get the appropriate services, the appropriate instruction, and are not misidentified as having a disability when in fact they don't. That's really my key. I think if we do that, then we're moving a long way toward improving the standard of care and the level of service delivery that we're providing everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you. For those who are listening, I do have just some wrap-up material to share with you. So right now, if you order the Ortiz PVAT, you will save 10%. And if you visit our website, mhs.com/Ortiz PVAT, you'll find out more about that. So that offer is available to you. And as well, if you advance the slide, there's more about that, what you're going to get today as being part of our audience. So you will get, if you go back to, actually, I think we're advancing too fast. There you go. So you're also going to get to have a free trial, which is going to be great. So
you get 2 free uses.
That's right. 2 free uses. And as soon as you activate that, you'll have 30 days to have your access to your 2 free trials. So that will give you some exposure to the test. And then finally, if you do have any other questions, which it's clear from the amount of questions that came in, you might, you can contact your sales reps. So I've got a map here first of everybody in the clinical and healthcare division, and the colors match up to who the sales rep and sales consultant is for your district. And again, the next map is going to show you who's for the education division for us. And I'd also just like to alert your attention to our Learn Center. So you can go to mhs.com/learn, and we have a number of CE credits available for you. You study the manual, answer a quiz in exchange for CE credit. So that's something that we offer for you as well. And finally, we did record this. So if you had any trouble with the audio or visual or having difficulties, you will be able to have the recording sent to you. We're also going to have handouts sent to you. So we'll have some samples and drafts of the new upcoming progress report. You'll get an intervention assessment report. And I think you're going to get the slides as well. Do give us about a week. So if you don't get it as soon as you turn off your computer, know that we're working on it. It takes a minute to edit the video and get it all uploaded. But if you don't hear from us in about a week, do let us know so we make sure we get all the handouts to you. And that's it. I just want to thank everybody on the line today for joining us for the hour. Of
Thank
course,
you very much.
Thank you to Dr. Ortiz for joining
My pleasure.
us
Thank you.
and
Thank you
sharing
for
your
hosting me.
information.
Go try the test. You're going to love it.